Good afternoon, everyone. You're at Radio Ubuntu, radio in the time of Corona. This week, we are discussing COVID-19, feminism, and women's rights with my guest, Lesley Abdela. Lesley, welcome to our program. Thanks for making the time for us. Before we start our discussion, I want to introduce you briefly for our followers. Lesley Abdela has 30 years of experience as a consultant, journalist, broadcaster, NGO leader, and women's rights and campaigner on. And she's a women's rights campaigner on women, peace and security, women's political participation and access to decision making, gender and environment, climate change, natural disasters, gender and media, and women's economic empowerment. She has worked as an expert advisor and consultant in more than 50 countries. She also worked in Cyprus. She won various awards for her work on empowering women and gender equality. So, Lesley, thank you again. Now, I want to start our discussion with a somewhat provocative question. In March this year, in an op-ed published in The Atlantic, an author called Helen Lewis basically published this article, and she argued that coronavirus is a disaster for feminism. So I want to kind of briefly summarize the key points of her article for those people who haven't read the article. She said that a possible economic crisis will lead to job losses, school closures, and household isolation are moving the work of caring for children from the paid economy, nursery schools, babysitters, to the unpaid one. And due to the existing structure of the workforce, women will have to assume more responsibilities in the, as carers, basically, as carers for children, as carers for ill people, etc. So, first of all, let me ask you this question. Do you agree with this argument? Are we really seeing a disaster for feminism?
I agree with the list of the situation, but is coronavirus a disaster for feminism? For the purpose of answering your question, I'll define feminism as the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of equality of the sexes. If we take that as what I mean by feminism, equality of the sexes. And I think coronavirus will be a disaster for feminism if we let it be, because it is about empowerment. And it's up to women and men to decide what sort of world do we want afterwards. So in my answers to your very thought-provoking questions, I spent all morning with your questions.
Really? I'm glad.
You got me hard homework. In my answers, I'm going to say that my theme will be that coronavirus will be a disaster for feminism if we let it be. And I'm going to try as far as possible to highlight the good that could come out of this extremely weird and in many respects tragic situation. So I'm in no doubt about the horrific situation the world is in on this, but it's up to us how we come out of it and what we make of it. And sometimes you need some awful disaster in order to open up windows of opportunities. So that is how I'm looking at it.
Okay, I've read an article by Deniz Kanduyoti, who is an emeritus professor at SOAS, and she is making an interesting remark. She's saying this lifestyle that we've been used to, like modern women have been accustomed to, on the one hand, they will have their careers, but on the other hand, they will have their families, was happening thanks to the sharing of the burden with other women. She says, the peace in the family was somehow maintained thanks to this burden. I'm talking about the burden of care inside the house. It was shared by other women. And of course, there's a difference, I guess, between advanced capitalist countries and third world countries. She was giving more examples from countries like Turkey or Latin American countries where labor is relatively cheaper in comparison to the advanced capitalist countries. And she was saying, so a woman could work and she could also raise children thanks to her mother, thanks to the person who came to look after her child, etc., etc. But now with the coronavirus crisis, what's happening is that all these like she was getting help from the other people, but now she's not in a position to get this help from the nurseries and from her mother and everything. So this is kind of, in a way, making things much more difficult. So in that sense, I kind of, in my mind, it's made sense to me what she said, and that's why I kind of asked this first provocative question to you, because it's as if all those things that made our lives easier as women, enabled us to kind of have careers as well as families, was not necessarily because the labor inside the family changed significantly and men assumed more kind of like more of the burden of the, let's say, care duties and taking care of the house, but it was because women were sharing this burden with other women. So what do you say to this remark? Does that make sense?
Yeah. To some extent, again, it's who, where, what. I mean, I see a change in generations. If we're talking about here in UK, I've noticed with my son's generation, there's much more sharing between, if it's a male and a female partner, between the two of them, how they juggled careers and childcare, etc., than it was, say, in previous generations. But I come back to, it's how we handle the aftermath. I mean, right now, the lockdown situation is strange, very strange for everybody. For example, if you live in an apartment in a big city, in London or anywhere, and you've got, say, 2 or 3 children, and if it's a husband and wife or a single parent, it must be a nightmare, because you're homeschooling and you're trying to work and you're not allowed to go out. Now you can go out for exercise once a day or to the pharmacy or something like that, but you're not allowed to properly go out. So as much of normal life now is suspended. It's been suspended here for 3 months, some countries longer, some shorter. At the same time that you have this household isolation, the caring for children, as you say, not having backup of grandparents or babysitters or whatever. That's very much a first world take on the whole thing. And I think that what we should be doing, I mean, we've been talking about these issues for over 30 years, the need for proper childcare, proper backup for parents, whether they're single parents, whether they're same-sex parents, whether they're husband and wife, as services. And some of the more advanced, say, Nordic countries are way ahead of us in Britain, and other countries have got even less, but then rely, as you say, on home help and so on. But I think it's up to us to say, look, this has highlighted these problems. So how do we what sort of way do we want to organize things when they're over? I mean, you and I are talking now online. Possibly more education will be online in future. And not everybody will have to go to the school every day or, sorry, just my hair is getting blown. There's a window open here, so my hair's getting blown all over the place. Sorry.
That's okay.
It's a windy day here. So yeah, I think it's going to be, we have to decide what we want to do afterwards. Now, there were lessons to learn. If I can jump from first world, because that was a first worldish question, but I'd like to bring in a more global look. If we look at previous epidemics and what happened afterwards, we didn't learn the lessons. If we look at after Ebola, for example, in the countries that had Ebola in Africa, West Africa, and so on, after that, there were all sorts of repercussions that did push women back, because the women took on a lot of the caring responsibilities, but even right down to you couldn't get children vaccinated, say, from measles and things. So later, when the children got ill, who had to have work, the women came off work. So nobody had thought of the downstream issues. We're not learning the impacts of maternity health services, all the things that happen after these People have conferences, and I'm sure there'll be conferences in Cyprus and Africa and India after this, and people will write PhDs and all that stuff. But what we're not getting is, we're not deciding who do we want in power and what are going to be our values and how do we want to organize our lives, whether it's a cleaner planet. We've noticed much cleaner air since the epidemic. We all wake up, or most of us wake up now to terrible news about the latest deaths. Britain, as you probably know, is one of the highest rates of death in Europe on the disease. And you're quite right that women have been locked in, and so have men, but dealing with these issues, we're all juggling with these issues right now. But how are we going to, are we just going back to, when I hear people saying back to normality, I get angry and I think, what normality? This is an opportunity where, as we come out of this, which eventually I'm sure we will in some way, we should be thinking, how do we want things to be organized? What priorities? It's all about who spends what on what, who decides what the priorities are. And if you haven't got a diversity of leaders, women and men, different ethnic groups, different ages, if you haven't got that diversity, how are you going to solve the problems?
Exactly. Lesley, there's a comment, I think one of your colleagues or friends, Indupant Kimira, he...
it's true, in Nepal.
Okay, so, she says, hi Lesley, good to hear. Good to hear you. That's what she wrote.
She's great, yes.
Okay, perfect. So this brings me, of course, my second question. I mean, we know that around the world there has been a significant rise in domestic violence these days. So what are the reasons behind this, do you think?
Well, I think they're pretty obvious. Again, if there had been a leadership before this started, they would have signaled it immediately. If you shut people up in houses on the lockdowns, particularly under stress, it doesn't matter if it's after an earthquake, as Indu, I'm sure, was handling in Nepal recently, sadly, if it's war, after any disaster, when the rates, we all know the rates of violence against women go up. But we also know that there is violence against women in homes, and we've known it for years and years and years. And what do we do about it? I don't want to swear, but I could say bugger all, actually, very little. Now, here is an opportunity to relook at it, because it has been highlighted a lot in the last few months since lockdown. The UN have highlighted it. Our own leaders have highlighted it. There's a chance to look at how we change things. If I can, for this one, use perhaps one or two examples from UK, from the United Kingdom. Your question is why. I think why is fairly obvious to anyone listening. Why? You shut up people under stress. And there is a leader of the UN speaking. You've got a bit of film up there. Excellent.
Yeah, yes. No,
are you going to see him? Or because I can...
No, just continue talking.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, almost immediately when this happened, in Britain, 22 of our main organizations that work on, mostly voluntary organizations who work on domestic violence, actually published something saying that it's highly foreseeable that COVID-19 pandemic and the emergency measures will lead to an increase in violence, just as everyone was highlighting it. Again, my answer is this has been an opportunity to actually try and introduce some good things. So some things good have happened already here, to my amazement. The British government, who've not been that fast on doing a lot on domestic violence, but now they have actually swung into action. They've been pushed into action. They haven't swung into action. They've been pushed into action. For example, Secretary announced a new national communications campaign, #YouAreNotAlone, to reach out to people who are experiencing abuse in the home. And then with that came a £2 million money, much needed because they had been cutting back a lot on refugees and so on, for support services. The National Police Chief made an announcement reinforcing it and saying how extra activities the police are going to do to support women who are experiencing abuse, and locally in police as well. But then we've had some quite interesting things come up, like at the request of the women's organizations, one of our largest pharmacy companies, Boots, who have about 2,400 branches across the country, have designated a space in their pharmacy. Any woman who is experiencing violence can go to that safe space, and there they'll be given access to services they may need, police services, legal services, medical services, help to move to somewhere safe if she needs to. And they're asking that other pharmacies do the same. And I believe in France as well, some of the pharmacies, and there have been also pop-up centers where women can go for help. So these innovations are beginning to happen. There's been requests that any woman who needs legal help should get legal aid, financial legal aid, and be fast-tracked to get help. The police have said they'll do a lot more of, rather than the woman having to move out, of arresting the perpetrator. And it can be the other way around, of course, men who also experience domestic violence. But the police have committed to quite often arresting the perpetrator so the woman can stay with, if she has children, in her home. Because why should she have to move out? You know, this has always been, it seemed to me, rather upside down. Another thing that has happened here is it's been, I don't know if they've agreed it because the government needed to pay them, but they were discussing hotel chains, because the hotel rooms are all empty, would allocate rooms for women who are fleeing domestic violence until they find somewhere else to live eventually. It's interesting, also slightly interesting, that immediately when this happened, to help people who were homeless, men and women, the government did pay for accommodation for as many as possible of the homeless, but it didn't occur to them to make it an equal priority for women who might be suffering abuse, the usual hierarchy of needs or whatever. So it has already resulted in some things. I said other positive things. This is not related to domestic abuse, but it's a thought also I had. I noticed on role models that the emergency hospitals, they have built, within 2 weeks, they built, with the help of the army, huge emergency hospitals in London, in Bristol, in Birmingham, the big cities, 500-bed hospitals, emergency ones. And they're all been named after women. Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse, a lot of them. And the one in Birmingham is named after Mary Seacole, who was the famous half white, half black Jamaican woman who also nursed in the Crimean War. And so, you know, we're getting, again, it's a positive. These are positive things that are happening. Of course, there are other, even within Britain, I'm saying even in Britain, but in all countries, that are more difficult for Black, Asian, and majority ethnic and migrant women. They have more difficulties, language difficulties, cultural difficulties. And for the migrant women particularly, they're frightened to go to doctors or to report to police any abuse in case the police report them to the immigration authorities. And again, that's being taken up as an issue, that there should be a paywall between the police and the immigration authorities. I don't know quite how far that's got, but it is being discussed. So these are some of the things locally here. And the interesting thing, Amnesty International did a poll in Britain, end of April, so just a couple of weeks ago, on these issues. And 2,000 people were interviewed, if I remember rightly. 72% agreed that the government should do more to ensure all victims of domestic abuse are protected. 65% of people polled agreed that more funding should go towards protecting and supporting domestic abuse victims and protect them. And that I won't go through lots of statistics because it'll bore your listeners, but it's raised the issue much higher on the agenda, and I think we have to keep it up there. The danger is that when this is all over, everybody goes back to quotes unquotes same old normal. Are we going to do that, or are we going to take advantage of getting some change? And this is goes back to your original question about feminism. It's what are our values going to be?
Thank you, Lesley. I mean, the next question I was going to ask you, you already answered it, because I was going to ask you what kind of strategies can be implemented to kind of tackle the issue, and you kind of informed us about what is being done in the UK. But now the next question is, what about the women in the developing countries? How are they affected by this problem?
Oh my God, yeah. Well, as usual, I mean, you have to say the higher strata educated will have different problems from the other women, but many of the service sector jobs in countries are hit hard by the current crisis. And even like in Turkey, for example, you've got hotel receptionists, industries, in many countries, the people working in the garment factories, housekeepers, flight attendants, restaurant staff, hairdressers, domestic workers, etc. For example, half the unemployed or half the employed women in Bangladesh work in a textile area. So they're badly. And I was talking to my colleagues in Sri Lanka this week, because I'm working on a project at the moment in Sri Lanka from home in Sussex. I was supposed to be in Sri Lanka now. And sort of issues that are, again, the hidden issues. They are on strict lockdown, curfew. If you're seen on the streets, you're arrested right now. But things like sanitary protection for monthly periods, the price has gone up triple. Now, how does a poor woman buy protection? There's lack of access to contraception. So if you're a poor woman, the last thing you want right now is to get pregnant, but you can't afford or can't access contraception. So all these sort of hidden things that happen. And again, it's who are the leadership? Women would have noticed these things. We've said for years there should be sanitary protection was an issue in emergencies, and I say we, all of us who work on these things. It's sort of 101. It's basics, but it's still happening. These issues. So not only are they coping with lack of maternity services. I mean, after the Ebola issue, because the health services are overstretched anyway in many poor countries, it'll be more so. So maternity services will drop. That's going to affect women who are giving birth and for their sort of issues. Girls will drop out of school because the services will be overstretched. So we all know these issues. It's a question of what we do about, I mean, a lot of, we're all getting the wash your hands and sing happy birthday twice while I don't know if you're getting that in Cyprus, are you? Wash your hands all the time.
Yeah, of course.
Every time we put our hands here, my partner and me, under a running tap, we're aware that many countries, women particularly, but everybody, hasn't got access to running water. Millions of women and men have no access to running water regularly. How do they wash their hands? They can't afford soap. God knows what's going to happen when the virus runs through Africa more. I hope it doesn't. But
it is really worrying. Yes.
And it's enlightened self-interest because we are global, as we saw. You know, somebody does or doesn't eat a bat in China or wherever it happens. We don't know exactly the origin, but one thing in one part of the world has repercussions elsewhere. So if we don't look at these issues and support them, and that comes back to the equality of women, women's employment, women's education, and so on, it hits the whole world. It's not just that it's the right thing to do, it's an enlightened thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. I was reading something on the MENA region, and you know, in many countries now, they made this transition to online, like teaching in universities and in schools. But it said this transition, for example, it doesn't really take into account the differences within the family. For example, internet connection is already not so strong in many developing countries, and if you have, I don't know, 2-3 children, it's not going to be the girls who is using the computers mostly, it's going to be the boys, because there is a hierarchy also, and girls are basically at the end of this hierarchy. So there are this situation, this coronavirus situation, quarantine, it also kind of brings into the picture new challenges. There's already a number of problems, you know, in terms of gender inequality, but it seems like this situation is posing new problems. Okay, you kind of touched upon.
Sorry, can I just jump in on that one? There's also a rich divide. Even here in Britain, in our village, we gave somebody a spare laptop we had, because once they've had to learn online, single parents have often not got laptops at home.
Yeah, sure.
So, you know, how it's we've got to rethink a lot of things.
Yeah, I agree. It's not a developing country problem only. It's also something that we can see in the developed world. And on the basis of class, you will have these differences. Now, you already touched upon the reproductive rights, but I would like you to expand on it, because, I mean, the next question is, how is the coronavirus affecting women's reproductive rights? And we know that this is not only a problem in the developing world, but also in developed countries. For example, I read something on Italy where women were complaining that they couldn't get abortion because they couldn't get to the hospitals because of the pandemic. So, but what is happening with respect to this question, women's reproductive rights?
I touched on the aspects of maternity rights, which is also part of reproductive rights, and lack of access to contraception for many women as I said, in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure in other developing countries as well. You mentioned abortion. Because I'm also like you on lockdown, so I'm relying a lot on what I read in the media and see on the media. But I read somewhere about a case in the States as well, where the anti-choice people, the anti-abortion people, are using it as an excuse to make it that women are, all right, you're at home, you're locked in. That's no excuse to go and have an abortion. They're making it a turning pro-choice on its head. You chose to stay at home. So it's being misused in not just there, but it's difficult all the way around. And of course, you've got the issue too of, if you need medical care, do you dare go to a hospital? We have issues here in Britain at the moment where there's been a huge drop in, say, and I know of a case locally here, where someone who had, if they have cancer or if they have liver, kidney problems or anything like that needs treatment, they either felt because they didn't want to burden the health service, they shouldn't go, or they're frightened to go to the hospitals in case they catch COVID-19, coronavirus, in the hospitals or the surgeries. And it's even more so in developing countries. People are frightened to go for medical help. So in terms of, you know, women giving birth or needing abortion, as you say, all these services are being hit.
I agree. and that's why this first question keeps on echoing in my mind all the time. Like, what does this mean? Really for feminism, or all these rights that women achieved.
It comes back to the nub of it. The nub of it is who is running the world.
Yeah,
if you've got I'm not saying men or women. I mean, an interesting, odd thing. We don't know why. Nearly 80% of the deaths from COVID-19 are men.
Yeah.
We don't know whether it's because men smoked more, or whether it's the genes, or whether it's to do with estrogen. We don't know yet. So little is known about this extraordinary virus. But if you have a multiplicity of people, we know from research, Catalyst, McKinsey's, they've all done research on organizations that are run by a more diverse group of women and men and different people thinking different ways, are financially more successful with their customers because they can relate to them, etc., etc. But we're not running our countries that way. There are a few countries, and we can come to that at the end if you remind me, that interestingly have women leaders. And are they running them differently, or is it because those countries were already in that situation, so they have chosen women leaders? Perhaps we can touch it now, but not just New Zealand and Finland and South Vietnam? I'm trying to remember, but anyway, there are about 7 countries. Germany, very diverse. So I come back to feminism, really, or equality, is who are making the decisions. Here in Britain, sure as hell, it's not women making decisions. There's a little cabal of about 4 young-ish, young to me anyway, they're in their 40s, men at the top, seem to be making all the decisions without thinking. They suddenly announced, for example, this week, that the junior schools, the primary schools should reopen. Didn't occur to them, if they do that, how can the women, and people should, where possible, go back to work in some areas, sectors. Well, how do parents do that? Because who's going to collect the children from school? They're not thinking properly.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you this question. So, we've seen this, like, in a number of countries, women leaders have been, and it's been basically discussed whether having women leaders, did it help to kind of deal with this pandemic much more successfully? So what really explains this? I mean, is it their gender that explains?
I made a mistake earlier. I didn't mean that South Vietnam. I meant Taiwan, a woman leader in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
I think. Okay. I hear your question. And we don't know whether, and you've probably seen the articles in Forbes magazine and the other magazines, is it because those countries were already fairly developed in many ways and economically successful in many ways, that they produced women leaders? Or is it because they have women leaders or what? We don't know yet. But it is interesting that Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Germany, New Zealand, Norway, and Taiwan do have women leaders, and seem so far to have done quite well on this. But I come back saying, let's look. I don't know how well. I think their governments are also quite well balanced. A broader group of women and men making the decisions, discussing more consensus. But I don't know in detail yet. And I'm sure people will come up with all sorts of theories and research on it. But my own feeling, which has been for many years, is you need this diversity of leadership. And when it gets one, it was quite interesting after Rwanda had the tragedy, and they realized the men had made an awful mess of it. And so they now have 65%, 66% women parliamentarians. Now that the person in charge is still a man, so I don't know what the balance of power actually is. But it is an opportunity. I have noticed that after conflicts, it has often been the opportunity to have a much higher proportion of women in the parliaments and in the governments. We've seen it time after time.
I agree, Lesley, but there's also this critique of liberal feminism when it comes to women's participation in the parliament. Of course, it's very important to have more women in the parliament, but there are examples like Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady in Britain, and the critique there is that Margaret Thatcher was a woman and a strong woman, but when you kind of look at the policies that she was following, it was anything but in the favor of women, because neoliberal policies did not really benefit women. The most significant groups that are affected from neoliberal policies, one of the groups are vulnerable groups and women, because social welfare.
I can ask the Margaret Thatcher question, because I actually stood for Parliament at that election when she was elected. I was in another political party, so I watched quite closely. I've met her a couple of times.
Okay.
But it comes back to what I'm saying. She was one woman out of 19 women and 635 men. And the last thing most of them wanted was a women leader, most of the men. You can't look at it that way. It's when you get, say, at least 30 or 40% women and at least 30 or 40% men, and the other can be either or. And when there's the space for women and men to share the thinking, to have the diverse views, if we look at just one individual on their own, I mean, it's like asking somebody to go from one culture, let's say from Japan, come and run Cyprus next year without knowing your customs, your culture, your language. And so if you have just one woman on its own, I mean, there is always this argument. I remember having this discussion with Edward, who was one of our prime ministers, and I was at a lunch party at his place. Dropping names here. I only ever once went to his place. It was interesting, because he turned to me and he said, because he knew I was campaigning for more women in Parliament in Britain. And he said, I'll tell you something, Lesley, because he didn't like Thatcher, because she got rid of him. But he said, I'll tell you something, Lesley. After that woman, you'll never have another woman leader in your lifetime in this country. And I said, and I answered, usually you don't always think of the right answer at the right time. This time I did. And I said, Mr. Heath, you're a logical man. If you took that logic, and I'm not comparing Margaret Thatcher to either of these leaders, but after Stalin and Hitler, you would never have had another man political leader in the world. It's an illogical argument, and we have to show the illogical.
Definitely, I agree with you on that. In that respect, it's just I was having this discussion also with some colleagues, and they were talking about Margaret Thatcher, as a strong lady, and I said yes, of course. Oh, she was a strong woman, and I have a lot of respect for her, even though ideologically speaking we are very different. But you need to also look at the policies and what she did. It wasn't really beneficial for single mothers. It wasn't really beneficial for women in general. But this issue is important. Okay, this brings me to another question. Now,
but just to counterbalance it. All right, let's look at, say, Jacinda Ardern, or some of the other women leaders that have been, there will be good women leaders, there will be bad women leaders, there will be mediocre women leaders. There are good men leaders, bad men leaders, mediocre ones. But, I mean, if we look at the moment, at the number of wars going on, at what happens after war, and how time after time, despite all the United Nations resolutions, we have very few women involved at the top levels in the peace building, deciding what sort of society they want afterwards. Now, this virus has been framed by mostly the male leaders in the vocabulary of war. They've said we're waging a war on COVID-19. They're using that framework. In that case, after the war on the virus, who is going to have the say? Who is going to be involved in shaping the post-war society? And this is why I'm saying that we could make it an opportunity for better equality for everybody if we want to. Or we could just sit back and let the same old take over.
No, I want to bring the issue to Cyprus. You also worked on Cyprus, and you know this process with like UN Security Council 1325 implementing it here as well, because we have peace negotiations ongoing for the last 50 years, but the problem was there were not enough women on the negotiating table, and there was not also a gender perspective. And after 2015, a gender technical committee has been established, but unfortunately, because the peace negotiations failed, that process did not go very far either. But this is something that women, like feminists in Cyprus, are also discussing right now. I mean, the fact that you gave Rwanda is a good example, because just like you said, we can see this pandemic a bit like a conflictual situation, because what happened in Rwanda after the genocide, they kind of managed to increase female participation in key decision-making mechanisms, and especially in the parliament. So yes, this can be seen as an opportunity for us to kind of push for like more women and gender perspective, gender equality perspective.
I have a something I am promoting on that very strongly. I'm glad you brought this up, Umut, because we've all tried, and Cyprus is a good example. Year after year, decade after decade, I've seen fantastic women activists from both sides of the island in Cyprus who should, and so you say, why? And so I now say that as the international community fund a lot of peace talks, not just Cyprus, elsewhere, Taliban, everywhere, they pay for the airfares, the international community often pay for the hotels, the conference rooms, etc. We should say, we, the taxpayers, all of us women, do not want our money to be used to pay for any peace talks, mediation talks, unless there are at least 40% men and at least 40% women at the peace tables. Then you have to say, well, how do you choose which women are men? That needs discussing. But if it were made as an equalizing quota, which you can do within the UN, it's called temporary special measures. So you say for a certain time, it's there in the UN framework. You could do this. We could tomorrow. We could say one of the talks on Cyprus or anywhere else should be allowed. You wouldn't stop them taking place, because who wants to stop peace talks? But if they want any funding towards it, it should only be on condition that half the mediators are women and the mediators are trained. Mediators, the UN there are now trained who are women. They used to say, but they're just not brought in as key mediators. And also, any mediator is supposed to bring a gender perspective to any of the peace talks and cover all these issues. But they don't do it. It's implementation.
Yeah, thank you for this intervention. So
that's something I feel very strongly about at the moment.
Okay, I will continue with my very last question. Now, we've discussed a number of things, but I also want to ask you the effect of the lockdown on women with special needs, migrant women, sex workers. How is this affecting these groups of women?
I don't know enough firsthand, so I can only know, but migrant women I mentioned to you, they have a double thing because they're frightened, particularly in the States, but also here, they're frightened that if they go for any help, either financial or medical or anything else, that then they'll get reported and eventually deported. So it's a trip, and then there's often language issues as well. In terms of sex workers, I assume that it's rather like the same situation for women traders in, say, Sri Lanka, where women who sold on the streets no longer have an income because they're not allowed to trade on the streets. So what happens to them? This is the invisibility. We're all locked down here. We only know what we know from media, from each other, from chatting now on programs like your important program. So I assume that it's not, it's dire, as you said, access to contraception, danger of disease, like there was with HIV, all the sort of things that anyone working on these issues is aware of. But it's how do we involve people and local people more in, for example, tracking the disease. Here, it's still being very, very haphazard, testing and tracking. Doing another agenda thing that, again, invisibility. It sounds small, but it was dangerous. A whole lot of clothes came for protecting the medical staff, our wonderful national health doctors, medics, and so on, that were all designed for men. Well, they were too big for the women, so they didn't protect them because, it didn't fit properly. Now, had you had, I'm sure, the right sort of women and men, or men who've been trained on these issues, they would have made sure they ordered different sizes. Now, I remember back when I was working with civil society in Iraq, we had to wear these flak jackets, to protect you. But they weren't designed for women's bodies. They were very, very uncomfortable and rubbing your breasts, if you put it brazenly, because nobody thought about these things. So often it comes down, it's the big things, but the small things are the indicators of what's happening on a bigger scale.
But I just want to jump in here. I mean, I find what you say very, very interesting, because we know that if you look at various researches, majority of the social and health workers are women in the world. This is the case also. And this was something that also came out recently. I mean, you're talking about an army of women who are working as social workers, health workers, sometimes in the services sector, working in the supermarkets. And these women are working at the front lines. And women might not be dying in thousands in comparison to men, but this doesn't change the fact that they have to be dealing with this. They are more exposed to this pandemic because they are working at the forefront. And these are women who are not paid like significant amounts. So, but what you're saying is even more interesting. Even though they constitute a significant majority in the health sector, how come these like protective gear?
Particularly social care sector here. The social care sector is over 80% of the employees in the social care sector here are, I hope somebody's going to answer that. 80% of the social care workers here are women. They don't have high status, they are skilled, they work hard, and they're paid very little. And double the number of care workers who died from COVID-19 here to men are women. Not in the health sector. I don't know the statistics in the health sector, but what I'm saying is you're absolutely right. The huge number of the nurses are women. A lot of doctors now are women, but particularly nursing here is low paid, and it has a high status at the moment. Everybody's admiring them, clapping them, etc. But they don't pay them properly. And it's a rather interesting thing to me that some years ago, some research was done on equal pay, women and men's jobs, looking purely at points. So what were you responsible for? Well, a nurse was responsible for life or death. An accountant was responsible for money and something else. And on the basis, how many years training, how many hours you worked. And on points thing, some Canadian research showed that nurses should be paid exactly the same as chartered accountants. And when you think about it, I mean, how do we value in society? I noticed surgeons, when I first went to former Soviet Union countries, surgeons were 50% women, medical surgeons. And it was quite a low paid profession there. Here in Britain at the time, only about 6%, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, were women. All the rest were men, and it was a highly, and still is highly paid profession. Yeah. So, it is that value, it's what you put your finger on it. We have to look at valuing what people do better, in a better way. Then we're short of nurses now. I mean, we're short of all medical staff, and our medical staff actually, as you said, and also the frontline workers in the supermarkets. A lot of them are women, and they're keeping us alive right now in food, and they're all cheery, the men and women, and they're all being cheered quite rightly by everybody. But will they be valued afterwards? Can we have a rethink of paying people properly so that they get also proper pensions? Because we can get much less pensions because half in Britain are part-time workers, so they get full pensions. So yes, we've had our gripe, but I still want to come out optimistic that it's up to us whether, to answer your question, it's going to be bad for feminism or for equality or good for equality. And it's in our hands. If every one of your, I don't know how many people listen or watch your program, but if every one of them decided they would stand for local councils, stand for parliament in their country, and ask if two friends, like the virus, transmit it to two other people. I'm not joking, the virus is a horrible, horrible thing. But the same principle, you can see how you can spread something across the world. And everybody could change it if they want to.
Lesley, Maria Hajipaulu sent us a message, so I just want to read it. Sending my love to you both. COVID-19 can be an opportunity for transnational feminism to work in solidarity about all our basic rights on issues of equality in all aspects and meaningful participation whenever a decision is taken to affect women's lives. To look at this from an intersectional perspective, we should continue these conversations. So she's sending us her love.
I couldn't say a better ending than that. Maria, you said it perfectly. Thank you. Sending you love.
Yeah, and actually, one of our students, one of our brightest students, Rava Ahmed, she's a feminist also, and she also sends her comments. So I also want to read her comments to you. After the Ebola outbreak in the West African region, the levels of teenage pregnancy rates reached a great spike by 65% due to underfunding of recourses on reproductive rights and contraceptives, as well as an increase in forced marriages in West Africa due to the economic stress put on families during, but also after the epidemic. So what she's saying is really alarming, right? It's really worrying. So,
but we've seen it time and again. I mean, forced marriages and young women being married off after disasters, after the tsunami, after Ebola. The thing is, we know these things happen, but what do we do about it? I remember talking once to a general, a British general, and it was about women and peace. We were just having a conversation. And I said, why is it, how do you change things? What makes things change? The same thing happens again and again and again. And he said, in his observation, things only change when there is such a terrible disaster that then finally people wake up and change them. And I always remember him saying that. His name was Rupert Smith, General Rupert Smith. And I think he wasn't talking just specifically about women. He was talking about how do you bring about change. Mm-hmm. And I think I can't think of a bigger disaster to the world than we have right now, except parallel to this climate change. We have an opportunity. We can make it better. We can make it different. And thank you to that, I don't see her name, but the last person who sent in that message. Because by highlighting Rawa Ahmed, it's people like her who are going to change it.
Yes, we have a lot of belief in this young generation. They're so cool, my students. I mean, you have to see these young, bright women. They're so passionate about changing the world, and they're so like reading, opening their minds. It's so impressive, really.
But the men have to come with it. The men have got to change as well.
Well, I'm
because
hoping.
If they change, they have to change too.
No, I agree. I agree. Well, I'm also seeing some really bright young men amongst our students who seems to be really open to change. But of course, with male privilege, it's not so easy, I guess, to let go of that male privilege. In many of the societies, men are simply accustomed to kind of holding on to power and all these privileges that come with, being a man. So basically, I'm not sure if they're really easily going to let go of that privilege and share the burdens of life with their partners and everything. So that needs a real kind of shift of the mindset. I don't know. I don't think we're there yet, but still, let's maintain the hope that change is possible. Well, we have almost come to the end of our program, Lesley. Thanks a lot. It has been a very interesting discussion for me. I really enjoyed it. Do you have any last words? Any last words? Do you want to say anything?
Just because of what you just said, which was very true, can I give you one of my favorite Marxist quotes?
Please do, please.
Now I'm talking about Groucho Marx, the comedian, not the other Marx.
Okay.
And Groucho Marx, the comedian, once said, "Madam, I would give up my seat to you if it wasn't for the fact I'm sitting in it." And that was what you were just saying.
All right, Lesley. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for making the time.
Having the program.
Thanks.
Stay safe. That's important now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have come to the end of our program. We have 2 more programs to go until the end of May. So I'll see you next week at 3 o'clock. Take care. Bye-bye.